So my name is Michel Bauwens, and I would like to use this conversation and this video to explain why I wrote this open letter to Pope Francis. So the first reason is historical. It's about the key role that the Catholic Church has played in a previous phase transition from one mode of civilization to another, from one mode of production to another. And that's the end of the Roman Empire and the beginning of feudalism. Now, when societies and civilizations are faced with resource and energy scarcity, which was what happened at the end of the Roman Empire, then there's two things they do, usually. And one is the mutualization of immaterial resources, and the second one is the mutualization of material resources. And the Catholic Church, especially the monks, the institution of monasteries, played this double role at the end of the Roman Empire. For example, I would consider the global community of Catholic monks in Europe as a global open design community. These people didn't have copyright and patents. They were active in farming, they were inventing new techniques, and because in a feudal society they were the ones traveling, the only ones maybe, they were spreading this technical knowledge all over the European continent and creating a unified civilization around this new knowledge. And there's been several books by historians like Jean Gimpel, the first medieval industrial revolution, I think it's called, which explains this in more detail. So this is one thing. The other aspect is that the monastery itself is a productive community that mutualizes its physical infrastructure. So monks live in very modest environments with a room and a bed, but most of everything else is actually mutualized so that it can be used by the whole community. And so it's this combination that basically created the conditions for a new phase of history in Europe, and I think that's an interesting role there. Now, a second interesting moment in this connection between the role of the Catholic Church and the phase transition at the end of the Roman Empire came out in a book by Robert Moore called 975, The First European Revolution. Now, the story that this book tells us is that there was a social movement led by the monks in France called the Peace of God movement. So we have to remember this was a time where the first attempt to recreate the Roman Empire under Charlemagne had failed. And so there was a period of encastlement. So all these little lords were building their own castles, but also frequently going at war with each other and abusing the local population. And it's against this abuse that under the leadership of monks in France, the monks of Cluny especially, the monks and the people would confront the feudals with their sins. You have to imagine this was a period where everybody was really believing, and so to be confronted with the statue of Mary and all the people behind it to confront your sins was something very powerful. And they actually succeeded, according to this book, in creating the new social contract that would become feudalism. And basically it would be, okay, you feudals, you stop doing war all the time. Marry each other if you want to grow your land. And this would be sanctioned by the church. And the second aspect was, and this was a price to pay, and of course we can critique that, by the serfs themselves, which was the interdiction to hunt for meat on the lands of the lords. And it's this combination, this, if you like, compromise, that made the basis for the next 3 centuries, where we see a doubling of the European population. We see the cities coming again, especially in Italy. We see the roads being rebuilt. So we have this thriving European civilization from the 10th to the 13th century, which creates the first industrial revolution around agricultural machinery. So again, we have this here, an example of the important role that the church played in this phase transition. More generally though, the role that the church played was to soften, if you like, the feudal system by being the guarantor of the moral economy. There was no capitalist market in the Middle Ages. It was a moral economy. That meant that the prices in the local markets were mostly set according to social custom and according to the prestige of different social groups. So the system basically says if you're an artisan, this should be your lifestyle, and the prices were managed in that way by the cities, but also the church had a role in that. One example that comes to mind is the Banks of Piety, which was a Dominican project. This is the end of the 13th century. A thriving culture in the south of France, the Cathars, which was a heresy. And the bad way to react to it was repression, of course. The First Crusade destroyed the civilization and basically exterminated the Cathars. But a more positive response was the Dominican Banks of Piety, which would lend money to the poor at 0 interest rates and drive out the usury from the regions where they were active. So this is a kind of role, I think, which we can interpret today as positive. Now, if you look at the emergence of capitalism with Adam Smith and the ideas of Adam Smith, the idea there was to achieve true pricing. And in other words, to do away with all the moral constraints around the economic system. And today, of course, with hindsight, we have a certain welfare, at least in Europe, and growing economies in some other regions, along with the misery. But we have to see that this was an extraordinarily negative experience at the beginning of capitalism, where, for example, we look at the situation in India, millions of people die from hunger, in Ireland, but also in England until the 1850s, very harsh social conditions, because all these protections were undermined. And then the French Revolution, the English Revolution, all ended up by severely constraining the power of the Catholic Church. Now, today we are facing a new phase transition. We have this capitalist economy which believes that nature is infinite, so we have false abundance, infinite growth, which is really a cancer on the planet. And then we have this other idea of artificial scarcity in immaterial resources, right? Where we think that knowledge, culture, science should not be shareable and constricted with all kinds of intellectual property restrictions. Now, one particular thing that is happening today is very similar to the end of the Roman Empire. It's first of all the mutualization of immaterial resources. The form it takes today is the open source movement, the free software movement, the open design movement. So we are again now facing the same kind of energy and resource crisis. And what does humanity do? What do certain forces in humanity do? They are first of all reacting by mutualizing knowledge, by making shareable knowledge a new cultural norm against these hundreds of years of enclosure of knowledge. The second reaction would be mutualization of material resources. How do we do this today? Today it's the hacker spaces, the co-working spaces, the fab labs. So we have people getting together in common spaces, sharing their knowledge, but also sharing their machinery, and developing a new type of machinery, right? So this is what I call the open and distributed manufacturing revolution, where through new technologies like 3D printing, we can reimagine a new mode of production where everything that's light is global and everything that's heavy is local. So relocalizing production, mutualizing that production, but the knowledge is circulating on a global scale. This is remarkably similar to the change that happened at the end of the Roman Empire, and which created the feudal mode of production. Now, what does this have to do with the Catholic Church? Bear with me. I want to make one particular argument, and this is what the open letter is about. A few years ago, I visited a community called Communautique in Montreal, and they were taking over an abandoned church and making it into a really vibrant social center. I also visited the Augustine Center in Melbourne, which has a been the locus of a really rich community life and a course in social change. There's a famous project called the An Monastery in Italy, which is a secular community, which is working on these mutualized knowledge and production methodologies. And I could give you some more examples like that. So here we have, on the one hand, a movement of young people yearning to make a change, becoming social entrepreneurs, creating maker spaces and co-working spaces to do things differently, to share knowledge and eventually mutualize their means of production. On the other hand, we have in cities like Montreal, I was told there that there were 60 to 65 empty religious buildings. Now, some of these buildings, which are beautiful buildings, which have a spiritual architecture, which creates a certain way of being and feeling, if you like, are being sometimes sold to the marketplace for real estate speculation, to make hotels and discos. And I think there's another way. I think that given the real estate crisis, given the enormous speculation on the real estate market, that if some of the institutions of the Catholic Church would open up these spaces and make them available for this new industrial revolution or post-industrial revolution, this would be a great match between the need for space and the need to change our productive system, and at the same time the availability of these idle resources. And so what I'm thinking of is a kind of meaningful co-working, or a spiritualized co-working, if you like. It doesn't have to be Catholic, and it won't be Catholic because I don't think this would work, but something that is in harmony with the original meaning of these buildings, right? And so I see the church as a vast coalition of institutions, social movements that are inspired, some of them by the common good. And so I think this dialogue would be very fruitful if we could have the use of these idle resources to again change historically the mode of production, the mode of civilization. So that's kind of the bet I'm making by writing this open letter to Pope Francis, because of the recent statements where there is very much a concern for the poor, there's a concern for injustice, there's a critique of capitalism, also the traditional critique of authoritarian collectivism, which I agree with. And in the end, the social doctrine of the Church is a really interesting document, because it says that civil society should be at the core, and that the market and the state should be at the service of civil society. And it has a notion like subsidiarity, which says that power should be devolved to the lowest, most efficient level. So these are ideas which I think are not so much in contradiction as actually in harmony and converging with the idea of the peer-to-peer commons and sharing movements. So let's have a dialogue. We don't have to agree on everything. Let's have a dialogue with what is still a powerful institution, and there's a growing social movement. And why not talk about possibilities of convergence and mutual benefit?